Well, now you know to discount everything you hear from Hunter Lovins. It's great to be with you today. Let's see if the slides come up sooner or later. There we go. We're in good shape. See if I can make this work. Does that work? It works. Good. So it was great to get a chance to meet Roger backstage before he spoke. You know, sometimes you go to these conferences just to meet the other speakers, and this was one of those cases for me. I've been following his work for a while and never had a chance to meet him. So his talk and his book was terrific. I agree with everything he said. And what he didn't say is that there are virtually, well, I could probably count on one hand the amount of professors in business schools that say what he says. And that's what makes him so unique. This whole question of questioning shareholder value is something that desperately needs to be done, but is not happening certainly in the elite business schools. It is happening in some of the sustainable business schools, like where Hunter Lovins teaches. So my journey into economic system design, as you all call it, I'd never thought of it that way. I think of it more as economic system searching. Really began in the 90s when I was still at JP Morgan, and I started wrestling with a question, which is, if I believe in the invisible hand and I believe in the golden rule, how do I reconcile those two? And that question continues to haunt me to this day, although less so. The answer is the invisible hand isn't real. But it really launched me onto a search for how economic systems could better work. And that was long before I knew anything about the ecological crises and long before the financial system collapsed. So my journey really since then has been wrestling with these questions. And I believe the statement up on the slide is very true. I think the difference between this systemic crisis and the one in Paulini's time is that we still don't understand the fundamental reasons why the system is unsustainable. If you trace back to, in my mind, the root causes, elevating from the stock market problems and the financial system problems, it's our economics ideology that is very much at the root cause of the problems. And of course, that's now not a new idea as a result of the collapse of the financial system and the feedback loops to the real economy. There's lots of people questioning economics, which is good. But this idea of efficient markets and the invisible hand, if we just deregulate markets and allow them to operate, good things will come, proved to be a very dangerous ideology, really. Equally dangerous, and perhaps more dangerous, is the issue that Roger just spoke about. And I lived at a time, or I worked at a time on Wall Street. I started in 1982 and left in 2001. So I pretty much rode the shareholder value wave. That's the only thing I ever knew. No one questioned that while I was there, and I didn't have the historical perspective to understand that that was a new idea. And it's interesting that Jack Welch ran GE during that entire time, and in my mind, as an observer, was the champion of shareholder value, the champion of hitting his earnings expectations every quarter after quarter, and essentially transforming GE, an industrial company, into a very significant finance company, and tricked the world into thinking that the finance earnings that were backed by a lot of leverage and interest rate risk were sort of fundamentally industrial company earnings, and got an earnings multiple on a growth rate earnings multiple that when the game ended, after he left, by the way, the stock collapsed by something like 80%. So this idea of shareholder value, which now even Jack Welch acknowledges is the dumbest idea in the world, still drives most corporate decision-making in the world, I would argue, certainly in public companies, and it's still what we teach in the leading business schools in this country and to my knowledge around the world. So there are real consequences to these ideological problems. The first is now well understood thanks to the popularity of Piketty and his book about inequality. But research long before that has shown that there's a correlation between inequality and a whole list of social and environmental and health problems. So the list is on the left, and you can see that the higher inequality as you move to the right, the worse these social problems become. And look who's over there on the upper right, the good old USA. And what this says is not only is inequality bad if you don't happen to be the rich people, but it's bad for you even if you're rich, if you live in a country that has high inequality. And if whether you're wealthy or poor, you're better off living in countries that are less unequal. And yet we have an economic system, and I would argue a financial system, that drives us toward greater and greater inequality. That's one problem. The second problem, of course, is the ecosystem crisis that I'm sure you've all spent lots of time talking about here and are well aware of. This research done many years ago now by Johan Rockström and his colleagues kind of puts this into a vivid picture, which is that there's a safe operating space on the planet given the scale of the planet and the biophysical systems and biochemical systems that run the planet, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, et cetera. And these researchers mapped in a conceptual way where we are with respect to that safe operating space, the playground that we can run the economy in without breaking the biosphere. And what this picture shows is that we should try to operate within that green circle. And it shows you in the middle, climate change, the carbon cycle, we're already exceeding the safe operating space. But even more alarming from a ecological system point of view, we've well blown through the safe operating space on the nitrogen cycle. And that's why there are dead zones at the bottom, at the mouth of every major river system on the planet. And even most concerning, if you really want to get yourself depressed, go to a biodiversity conference and hear them talk about the fact that we've now launched into the next great extinction. And because everything's connected to everything, it actually matters if the extinction rates are running well ahead, 1,000 times faster than what would be expected. So second problem with our current economic system and the design of it is that we're essentially breaking the planet, breaking the life support systems upon which we depend. And that's not something that causes us to all die tomorrow, but it is something that's deteriorating and clearly unsustainable in the long run. So if you sort of summarize all this into a picture of how our current system is designed, spoken to you as a finance guy with 20 years of experience in the system, I say it looks like this. We operate as if there's this thing called the planet, which is where we get our raw materials. It's where the people live, the society is. And those are all labor and raw materials that feed into this economic system. And the masters of the universe in finance, using ideas like shareholder value, optimize the running of this economy in order to maximize return to shareholders. And of course, any kitchen logic would suggest there's something wrong with that picture. And in fact, I would argue it's exactly inverted from the way it needs to be, which is that we need to recognize that the planet is the system. There was a speaker earlier talking about the Anthropocene. The human impact on the planet is now so big that we're changing the actual operation of the systems of the planet. So the economy is actually embedded in the planet. It's not separate from the environment the way we think about it in economics. And finance is a subsystem of economics. It should be in service to an economic system that operates within the finite planet of the boundaries and delivers the outcomes that we human beings, which is the purpose of the economy, it's a human economy, actually desire. So we have some real design work to do, in my case, real searching to do for answers. And to put all this in a very concrete, sort of immediate problem rather than the abstraction, this issue of stranded assets is sort of at the top of my list of sort of problems and issues that we need to deal with that we're barely even talking about. And this work was put in the public consciousness several years ago by a group in London called Carbon Tracker. And they put out a report that showed that there is, if you accept the 2-degree warming threshold that the scientific consensus says is where we need to keep the planet from going through the 2-degree threshold. And most climate scientists would say they'd much prefer 1.5 than 2. This is all statistics and probability. If you accept the 2-degree warming threshold and you understand that burning carbon or burning fossil fuels releases carbon, which creates global warming, then it's logic to understand that there's some carbon budget. There's a certain amount of carbon, given the long life, how long carbon lasts once it's released in the atmosphere. There's a certain amount of carbon we can actually burn before we blow through the 2-degree threshold. Well, it turns out that we've already discovered and is on the balance sheets of the oil and gas and coal companies and the nations that own these reserves, 5 times more carbon than the budget that we can burn. In other words, forget about the new exploration that's happening today and the $700 billion a year we're spending to discover new fossil fuel reserves. Just the existing proved reserves, if we were to burn all of them, we'd blow through the 2-degree warming. And in fact, we need to leave 80% of what we've already discovered in the ground unless we can come up with some technological fix to capture that carbon. And I wrote a piece several years ago called Our $20 Trillion Big Choice, because it turns out that those 80% of those fossil fuel reserves are valued at about $20 trillion. And that's compared to $2.7 trillion, which was the direct loss of the subprime crisis that triggered the recent Great Recession. So there's this daunting challenge of how do we absorb and write off $20 trillion of assets while we transition our economic system to one that runs on clean energy, renewable energy, et cetera. This is no, I wish I had some quick, easy answers to this, but these are the issues and the challenges that I've been wrestling with now for years in thinking about the design problem of economic systems. And again, a reiteration of the earlier introduction to the Anthropocene. I don't know if you can all read this, but it says, I gave you a nice planet, I gave you free will, you messed up. Now you can, it's your turn to fix it, or whatever, I can't even read it myself. But that's, I think, where we are. And through my own investing activity, I discovered this idea of regenerative systems, first through work on investing in the grasslands, and then in an investment project investing in regenerative buildings. And it's a group called Regenesis in Arizona that introduced me to this idea of regenerative living system building design. And my thinking about economic systems now is very much trying to extrapolate what is working in the built environment into the economic system in general. And the big insight, and there's a lot on this graph, but the big insight here is that, business as usual is off to the left, degenerative, using lots of energy, using lots of materials and wasting a lot. And this idea of sustainability is really just the threshold between survivable and not survivable. But the real system design needs to be about going well past sustainability into this idea of restoring and ultimately regenerating the multiple forms of wealth or capital that we need to operate. And so sustainability is really an outcome, not a goal. And so we're all sitting in this room alive and breathing because our bodies are regenerating as we're sitting here, not because our bodies are sustainable. And so the idea is that we can look to living systems which happen to work very similarly to energy networks. So this is sort of biology and physics aligned in the same way, and look to how those systems work and then contrast them with how the human economy works. And I think that's where my search is. I know that's where my search is, and I think that's where the answer lies in terms of economic system design. And increasingly we're hearing people talk about multiple forms of capital and how they need to be harmonized together as opposed to optimizing financial capital, which is easier to measure and report, but only obviously one piece of the equation. And I agree with Roger that the returns to financial capital need to be thought of as the last on a list, not the first on a list. And our new idea and understanding of how to grow and develop economic systems again, looking to living systems and energy networks like the internet is essentially an energy network. And the way energy networks and living systems grow and develop is through enhancing their complexity. So our system is far more complex than it was 100 years ago. That's good, but it didn't grow in a complex way that's ultimately sustainable. And there's lots of qualities around sustainable living systems that we look to try to implement or replicate in the human economy. Jane Jacobs, who probably many of you are familiar with, she had a great saying, "It's not how big you grow, it's how you grow big." And I think what we've confused is that we've concluded that growth is good regardless of how we get growth, and we need to kind of step back, slow down, and rethink how we're actually growing, whether it's a company or economies as a whole. Now, I have a paper coming out on this shortly, and I don't have time to go into all of these qualities here, but there are 7 elements that I've identified, in part through academic study, but largely through observation of real projects in the real world. And they're listed here, and I'll just talk about a couple of them very quickly. One is this idea of balance. And economics is all about efficiency. So over on the right is efficiency. And this, by the way, comes from actual study using real data of living systems. And it turns out that sustainable, healthy living systems balance efficiency with resiliency. So the answer isn't we need to have a resilient economy. Of course we need resilient economy. The answer, though, is we need to balance efficiency with resiliency. And my entire career on Wall Street is about optimizing efficiency and return on capital, particularly the efficiency of capital. So it's no surprise that our system skewed off to the right and got very brittle and collapsed. And there are similar relationships between large scale and small scale. If you look at your, I'll move to the next slide. If you look to, your blood flow circulation in the human body, you need large arteries and you need small capillaries to get to your fingertips. So the answer isn't we need small rather than big. The answer is they need to be in balance. One of the qualities of a regenerative economy is one that circulates resources, materials, energy, and information significantly throughout the system. And right now, the financial system doesn't do a good job at circulating money to, out of the center. And so much of the money has flowed to Wall Street that it's kind of stuck in the, as Roger again said, stuck in hedge funds speculating in stocks, as opposed to fueling the real economy in the periphery. I mentioned earlier, a lot of this thinking actually comes from studying real projects and real companies in the real world. And at Capital Institute, we have a project called our Field Guide to Investing in a Regenerative Economy, where we've written up these stories and using often the language of the entrepreneurs driving them, as opposed to our, it's not like we're academics trying to distill this. We're actually trying to tell the story through the creative lens of the entrepreneurs themselves. And I'd welcome you to come to our website and check this out. There's some fascinating projects. And for us, it's really interesting to see how increasingly we find these stories that reflect these elements of regenerative systems, and they're happening organically. It's an emergent phenomenon itself. So in closing, the importance of economic design, I don't think it could be said any better than John Maynard Keynes, who said famously, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men, now that's, the masters of the universe in finance and in industry, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences, have little time for academics, are usually slaves of some defunct economist. And I think that's so true today, that we need to really invest in rethinking the whole economic system from the bottom up. And once we understand how an economic system needs to work, which I believe are regenerative economies, diverse, place-based regenerative economies, that will then tell us how we need to redesign the financial system. But until we understand how the economy can work, it's almost fruitless to try to fix the financial system. So those are my thoughts. I appreciate your your patience with me. So.
Have a seat. The first thing I want to ask you is that I think most people get the idea that, oh, a regenerative economy sounds like it would be better. We know regenerative brakes are great for hybrid cars, et cetera. But can you help us out with describing a vision for what does a regenerative economy look like? Like, how would our lives be different if we lived in one?
So the best answer I can give is that it is actually happening already. It's just that we don't have a conceptual framework to see it. And so let me give you the example, since we're design people. Let me talk about the investment project I did. There's a town not far from here called Pound Ridge. It's a very rural, 4-acre zoning. They hate development. And essentially, the partner who's driving this bought an option from the prior developer who couldn't get a project approved. And essentially went to the town and said, one of your problems, well, first of all, they did this in-depth story of place where they did a history of this region, both geologically and culturally, to understand what makes Pound Ridge unique, and then designed the essence of that place into the project itself. And then the second thing is that the water table problem is a big issue there, and there's no central septic. So there's too many sewer systems. They're leaking into the groundwater. That's creating a problem for everyone. And so you needed to deal with that problem. And so we came in, and I'm shortening this to keep moving. We came in with a constructed wetland system, which is a natural design regenerative system that's never been done in New York State. And the town was so excited, including the environmentalists, that they actually want us to expand the constructed wetland to connect the local stores to it, because the wastewater problem is a huge problem for the whole town, not just this lot. So, the bottom line is we created a problem that allowed us to get a zoning change to move from what would have been 12 houses to 40 townhouse units. The town needs to increase its tax base. The town wants smaller housing so people can downsize and stay in the town. And the town needs to solve the water problem. And as financial investors, we changed the zoning from 12 houses to 40 units, so we're going to make money. So regeneration is unlocking potential that hasn't yet been found.
Well, and especially there's a great question here about how do we maintain local banking, local economies, right at the moment where the digital economy and even things like digital currency are essentially erasing the idea of local in the first place?
So I would challenge that assumption.
Good.
I don't know where digital currencies are going to go, but the money system, the flow of money is only one piece of banking. To me, the most important part of the banking function is the credit intermediation, the credit creation and intermediation process, meaning transforming savings into productive loans. And I think one of the unintended consequences of the reaction to the financial crisis has been to hurt small banks. They're suffering from the same, capital requirement changes and onerous regulation that the big banks are. But the big banks are the ones that deserve the attention, and the little banks are the ones that are actually the lifeblood of community businesses. And of course, the little banks end up with the third-rate regulators who are even more rigid about how to operate. So that's a real problem that we need to deal with. But I think any healthy economy requires small banks in communities to be healthy. And unless we get that right, we're never going to have healthy economies, regardless of what happens with digital money and all that stuff.
Sure. Last question. Describe how you're bringing different people together to solve this problem, to have the conversation to develop whatever the next solutions are.
So we call ourselves a collaborative space and at Capital Institute, and I collaborate with people from all different walks of life, including architects. I learned about this through architects. Hunter Lovins is a big collaborator you're going to hear from later today. Academics and practitioners. What is interesting is that I find there are entrepreneurs who intuit this and are going out and making it happen. And my work with Alan Savory on the grasslands, you can read about that at our website, is an example of that. He's been thinking this regeneratively for 30 years and making that happen on the world's grasslands. So it's not like we need to invent this and design out of our own egos. We need to be humble and look to living systems and energy networks. And there are entrepreneurs who intuit this and are acting this out in the real world. We just don't have a lens and a name for it and a conceptual framework so that we can see it. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Are designers part of that collaborative conversation?
They should be more than, I mean, coming to this
Good
conference
answer.
is sort of a, duh. I know Janine Benyus works with design firms a lot, and biomimicry is a big piece of this. And I would say my own interaction with the design world is primarily through architects. So
They're okay.
they're okay. Do they count? They're allowed in the door?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting to think of it as a design challenge, although I'd be cautious of, us thinking we're where we are because we think we're smarter than we are, and so humble design is what's needed, not.
Sure. Well, and I think the whole idea of prototyping and knowing that it's not going to come out of committee fully baked and ready to go, that idea of iteration, which is also at the heart of most architecture as well, might be a really good process to overlay or weave into what you're already doing. I'm kind of going to offer that this community, I think there's members in this community that would be very interested in helping you create a regenerative economy and creating whatever the templates are, the toolkits and the pieces, not just in the creation process, but in the documentation and then especially in the communication. Because if we don't communicate a vision for what does a regenerative world look like, then no one's going to be running to it. And if we do nothing better, if we do nothing else, we do communication really well.
Well, and I mean, Hunter turned me on to the book Story Wars. So yeah, I mean, the communication of this new story is, I spend a lot of my time working on that exact issue, and I'm not a communications specialist. So if anyone wants to take him up on his offer,
I just signed you all up.
Fullerton at capitalinstitute.org, or just go to our website. You'll find us, and we'd love to figure out a way to engage you all in this work. That'd be fantastic.